Thank you everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch is titled Online Storage and Backup, What Does Secure Really Mean? We're joined today by Mike Semel of Semel Consulting. Mike is one of the top HIPAA experts in the country with great expertise in IT security and compliance. I think a lot of HIPAA consultants give short shrift to data backup and disaster recovery planning, but Mike has extensive real-world experience with both. You could not find a better resource to address today's topic. Let's take a quick glance at the questions for today's session while I go over some housekeeping notes, and then we'll get into the presentation. Remember that you can ask questions of our presenter at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area. In the second half of our presentation, we'll address as many questions as time allows. If we do run out of time, answers to all submitted questions will be posted to our website and sent by email link later in the week. Also, remember that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of this event. So we often have folks ask us if we'll be sending out the slides after the event, and we certainly will do so. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you in these sessions. People really rely on your expertise.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's good to be with you.
All right, well, let's get into it then, and just talk a little bit about what is online backup.
Well, before we get started, Brian, one of the things on my in my bio is that I've been a customer of online backup. I've sold online backup, and I was also the chief operating officer for an online backup company. It wasn't planned. Our company had developed some resource with another company because back about 6 years ago, there were very few options. We couldn't really find any to recover servers into the cloud. So we developed our own, and then because of demand, we had other people that wanted to resell it. So we formed this company, and I was the chief operating officer. So when I talk about this, I've got background both in the kind of front end, being the customer, also a reseller, someone that was responsible for a lot of clients' backups and making sure that it wasn't the backup that was important, it was the ability to recover. And then actually working for an online backup company, I got to know the nuts and bolts of how it worked and what some of the problems we ran into were. So hopefully I can bring that information to you today and be able to help the people that are taking their time out for the call. So what online backup is, I mean, in some ways it's just what it sounds like, but it's an automated data backup process. So for today's conversation, we're going to talk about the automated systems. There are tools that you can use to copy files to the cloud and to share files in the cloud. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about specific systems that are designed to help people recover after a disaster. So online means across the internet. It can be direct to the online backup provider. You could do business with one of the companies that actually offers the cloud services, or you might purchase it through a solution provider, and we may have solution providers on the call today who resell those solutions. So what we're talking about doesn't have to do with necessarily who you pay with a credit card or write a check to. It's all the same concept. And let's talk a bit about what the type of backup is, because this is a backup for disaster recovery. The reason that we're doing this today is we're talking in relation to HIPAA. And HIPAA talks about the requirement to protect data and be able to recover it. HIPAA really doesn't care if your business survives a disaster. It cares if your data survives a disaster. And the reason I'm saying it that way is that there are a lot of statistics that show that businesses that lose their data will fail within a 2-year period. And businesses can go to have a lot of costs and a lot of effort to recover the business that's tied to their data. But what HIPAA is really focused on is protecting the data itself and making sure that's done securely. So there again, that's what we're going to focus on today. We're not talking about archiving. And archiving is important because there are state and federal compliance requirements for data retention. And when we're talking about online backup, that is not the system to use that's going to store medical records for, say, 6 years, or for, in some cases, it could be 28 years. There are states that have 7-year retention rules, and they say that the clock starts when the patient reaches the age of majority. So for a newborn, you take 21 years to the age of majority and then add 7 years onto it. That data has to be retained for 28 years. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the systems that are designed for online backup and disaster recovery, not archiving. One of the things that we ran into when I was working with the online backup company was that people wanted what we called long-term access to their data. And they would come to us and say, we want to recover the deleted email from someone that left the company 6 months ago. Well, the way that these systems work, they're designed, again, to recover. So essentially, what information's on your server today is going to be backed up. And then for a certain period of time, there's some retention rules that you can set. That information will be available to recover. But if we deleted someone today, and let's say we had a 30-day retention rule set, that means that in 30 days, their information will no longer be accessible because we won't have the backups at that point to go back to, because it would have cycled through. So there again, it's different than archiving for compliance. It's also different than archiving for email and also archiving for long-term access to data. There are some strategies that organizations can use to store that data. There's always a question when it comes to something like 28-year retention, what tools will be available, for example, in 28 years to be able to even read the media that the data is stored on. So these are discussions for another time, but what we're talking about here is we're talking about the backups of either data only for recovery or server images so that you can recover entire servers. I'm showing a picture of a tornado there, which is one of the first things that pops into mind when someone says disaster. But disasters can also mean what may be smaller and only affect your organization. For example, somebody deleting a critical file, or files being corrupted on a hard drive, or a hard drive failing, or a server having a problem, or something like that. So when we talk about disasters, also think of these smaller disruptions that can also interrupt your business.
Well, and just to circle back around, I often hear from providers that they're really surprised that HIPAA requires that they do disaster recovery planning.
Well, and I'm always surprised when people are surprised by that, because these requirements have been in place since 2005 when the HIPAA security rule came into effect. And that's almost 10 years ago now. So I'm not sure why people are surprised. HIPAA is all about the protection of data. So the privacy rule obviously is focused on the privacy of data, and also other information, even words in the spoken word. But the security rule is focused on the security of data and the protection of protected health information. And it's very specific in terms of having to have a backup plan and being able to have recoverable copies of your data.
Well, I think it's good that we're getting the word out, since there are people who, despite the fact that it's been a rule for a while, are still catching up on this issue. So what are the choices that folks have for backing up their data?
Well, there are a lot of choices, and when you read the different advertising for the different solutions, it can become confusing. And what I've done is I've tried to break it down to some pretty simple choices, and there may be some kind of hybrid versions of these, but essentially one is direct to the vendor, and that's literally where you have a computer or a server plugged in, and all the backups go straight from that system up through the internet direct to a vendor. And that's the strategy that some companies use. There are also a lot of consumer companies or products and solutions that advertise, back up your home PC and things like that. And in almost every case, that's the method that's used, where the data goes directly from the computer up through the internet to the vendor. Then you have the choice where it's stored locally on a disk and then to a vendor. So there's disk to disk, and then it goes from the backup drive up through the cloud. And when we talk about the cloud, we're just talking about a service that's available through the internet. So the backups go locally. So there's a copy made of the original data to a local hard drive, and then through the internet to the vendor. Now, the benefit of that is that you can recover faster than if you have to pull files across the internet. When you're doing your backups, they can take a long time because the internet is slow when you compare it to the wire speed of data, or even coming across a wireless network within an office. The internet is much slower than the speeds that you can get on a local network. So just imagine if you had your data backed up locally to a hard drive or even to a thumb drive or something that can connect directly to your computer or into your network, getting that file would be a lot faster than having to download it from the internet. And in some cases, we're dealing with very large files. We're dealing with things like the entire electronic health record database. We're dealing with tax images and other types of images, even faxes and photographs. And some of this may differ based on the specialty that the healthcare provider's in, but some of these files can be quite large. And if they're stored locally, then you can recover quickly. Now, why do you send them up to the cloud? Very simply, if your building burned down and you lost both your original data and that local hard drive, then you still have the ability to get your data back if the disaster damages your facility, or even enough of your facility that it takes out both the local disk and the backup. Then there's another concept, which is not just a disk, but having what we call a BDR. And a BDR is a backup and disaster recovery appliance. And when we talk about an appliance, essentially it's like a computer. And it would back up to the local disaster recovery appliance and then to the vendor. What's different about a backup disaster recovery appliance, a BDR, from just a local drive, is that a BDR is actually a computer that can act as a server. So the first thing that could happen is that if you lost a file, you'd go to the BDR and simply copy the file back the same way that you would have from a local hard drive. But then if a server fails, you can recover the files to the BDR and have the BDR replace that server while it's being repaired. So the BDR is a much higher level of recovery capability than just having a local drive, because you actually have what's essentially a server waiting in the wings, and it's available in case one of your servers fails. So you would have your data backed up and your server images backed up. So it could be an Exchange server, which would be for email, contacts, and calendars. It could be a SQL server, which is a database server. It could be a standard file server that just has folders and files on it from the users. But this way, you've got a quick recovery to keep the business going, and that's much faster than having to get your data and recover it and then physically go out and buy the components and build the server. And then you have the cloud. Because it's backed up in the cloud, some of the vendors have the ability to have you recover into their systems, into their cloud. So imagine your server goes down or your building burns down and you have to move to another location. You can remotely access your backup files, create a server in the cloud, and run your organization from your vendor's cloud until you can recover. And then we call that failing back. After you've got another building, for example, or more servers that you've purchased to replace the ones that were damaged in the fire, then you can recover your data back down and move back to the local operation. So let's go back and review. Direct to vendors, where you have a computer that is simply sending data straight up to the cloud. You have disk to disk and then to a vendor where the data, just data, is being stored locally as well as in the cloud. And then you have DDR solutions that allow you to back up your data locally, back it up into the cloud, and then also have server images that can be recovered either to the BDR appliance or to the cloud.
So tell us a little bit about what the benefits are of online backup.
Well, the benefits of online backup are pretty much the opposite of what we find in many small medical practices, where people are not being, they're not diligent about their backups. And in some cases, they don't use common sense in terms of where the data is actually located. And the risk is that they can lose data, which would be a compliance violation, but also that it would interrupt their business. So the benefits of online backup, first of all, is that it's an automated process. When someone sets up an online backup, they choose the files or the server shares or the drives to be backed up. And once that setting's in place and everything stays connected, then the process will just run on its own. So people don't have to babysit it, and, well, you do have to monitor it. But it's just a lot easier to manage because it's an automated process than if you're trying to remember to do things and having to put them on a schedule and having people actually touch systems. Online backup's efficient. One of the things that's from the features in some of these services and some of the software that runs them is that they do things like deduplication and also file compression. So deduplication says that if you're going to back up all the files for an organization, and just for example, let's say that every employee downloaded the employee manual, and you've got 100 employees. You've got 100 copies of the same PDF file sitting out on your servers, and that's not very efficient in terms of storage. But also think about backup. Backup takes time and costs money for the amount of data that you store. And when you're doing a backup, the less information that you can send, the faster it goes. And also, in most cases, there are some companies that don't charge for the amount of data, but most do, that it costs you less. So it's an efficient process. You can deduplicate and also compress. So back to that example where you have 100 employees and everyone downloaded the employee manual. When the system sees the first copy of the manual, it will back it up. When it sees that there's another person that's downloaded it and another and another and another, it will simply mark that that file's been backed up, and if that user has to be recovered, it will go and get the one copy of the file that it's stored so that it doesn't have 100 copies sitting out there taking up space and delaying the amount of, or increasing the amount of time it would take to back up the information. The other thing about online backups is that you can do multiple snapshots during the day. And what snapshots means is that in the old days, we used to have what we called the nightly backup window. And the nightly backup window was the time of day that we could start our backups and know that they would be done before people started work the next day. And I was a CIO in a hospital, and that became a challenge, obviously, because we were working 7/24, but we still had windows that it took, time windows, where we had to set it, and if it took 6 hours to run a backup, for example, we would start at, say, at 10 o'clock at night, and it would run until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then data increased dramatically. We now have more data than ever, and the statistics are that it's growing exponentially. So now you have the issue of having to store more, and then during the day, practices, say 10 years ago when HIPAA first came out and talked about online backup, or not online backup, but backups, most of the paper, or most of the records were paper. So paper was how work was done. Now that everything's moved to electronic, if you do multiple snapshots during the day, you could set them for every hour or every 2 hours. There are systems that will do continuous backup. Every time something's entered, it will back it up to another location. So the benefit of this is that if you do have an interruption, you lose less work and you don't have to go back and redo data entry. So you've got the ability to recover faster and lose less information. One of the obvious benefits of online backup is you don't have media to transport. So we work with clients who are taking hard drives home on a nightly basis or every couple of days. Some people are still using tapes. With online backup, you have better security than we've seen with a lot of the ways that people have been doing their backups. Security is relative, and we'll talk about that as we talk about how to choose a vendor. One of the other things, obviously, with online backup is you don't have media costs. You don't have the costs of tapes or drives that you have to manage. And then you also have 7x24 access to data. We work with clients who take hard drives or tapes to banks and store them in safe deposit boxes. And depending on what the disaster is or when it occurs, they may not be able to gain access to their data for days. I mean, if a bank is closed on a weekend, or if it closes Saturday at noon, for example, and you have a server failure at 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you may not be able to get to your backup tapes until Monday morning when the bank opens. So the advantage of online backup is that you have 7x24 access to data so that you can begin your recovery whenever the disaster occurs.
And that's assuming that the bank itself isn't substantially damaged by whatever the disaster is.
Well, that's a great point. And we have friends in Joplin, Missouri, who were affected by the tornado. And even though some of them weren't even in the zone that was hit by the tornado, they were affected because banks and streets and all sorts of other things were closed. And in some cases, it was impossible to get certain things done. And that's, as you say, assuming that the bank is accessible. The other thing is that we've seen people storing their tapes in banks that are a mile or two from their office, and that is very close. And these are people in what we would call Tornado Alley in the Midwest. And again, it's too close for comfort. The benefit of online backup is that most of the data centers are going to be far away from you, so that the data center where the backups are stored are not in the same area that would be affected by a disaster. And the company that I worked for as the chief operating officer for the online backup company, we had multiple data centers. So everything that was backed up to us was also backed up to another data center. So if we lost the data center, we could still recover our customers.
So what are some risks then of online backup?
Well, one of the risks is that backups will fail, and they'll fail for a lot of different reasons, but you can't just set it and forget it and hope. I've told people hope is not a business strategy. So one of the things that you have to do is monitor your backups. Backups can fail for different reasons. Sometimes they're just network glitches, or a computer, for some reason, something is wrong inside the system. Maybe the antivirus software is having a problem, and when the backup is set to go off, it tries to reach that computer, and it can't. It can't get to the files. So there are things that can occur that would interrupt the backup process. Internet interruptions. We all live through internet interruptions. But just imagine that if you're backing up across the internet, it's going to take 3 or 4 hours to back up, or 5 or 6 hours, whatever, that the odds are dramatically increased that you're going to have an internet interruption. And if there's anything that interrupts that connection, then the backup is not going to occur. That's one of the reasons why we like the concept of disk-to-disk, and even more than that, the BDR concept for backups, because at least the data is moved off of the main system onto another system, which can be local. And yes, local isn't off-site, but at least the data is protected in case there's a failure of the original system. One of the big things we see with online backup is that people set it up for servers and for, in some cases, desktop computers, but it really depends on your strategy of how you store data within your organization. So we've seen a lot of environments where people have set the online backup. We'll look at what the settings are, and we'll see servers that are set to back up. Then we'll find out that within their organization, they allow users to store data locally. So we'll go to a chief financial officer's or a financial controller's computer, or one of the executives or a nurse or anyone in the organization to look at their local hard drive and see what files are on there, compare that to the list of what's backed up, and we'll find that there's a lot of critical data that's on local computers, and even worse with laptops, because people take them home and they travel and they sit in the case overnight instead of being connected to a network. Those systems will miss getting backed up. So one of the big things that we had to do with our clients when I was selling online backup was to really identify not just what their devices were, but did they allow users to store information on their local systems, and if so, we would add those systems to the backup. And then if they were traveling, we would tell them, plug your computer in at night, and we'd get alerts. So we had we had reports that came in that we would review every morning and see what systems were backed up. And we would call people like business executives. I remember calling a school superintendent who was traveling and asking him to plug his computer into the network before he went to bed that night in his hotel so that we could make sure that it got backed up. So there's a lot of, when we talk about missed data, we're saying you're missing devices and you're missing locations of data that should be backed up. One of the problems with the internet being part of the backup process is that the internet, again, I said this earlier, is relatively slow compared to having systems connected to the local network. So if you want to save money and store your data on an internet service, a web-based cloud backup service, that's fine, but just realize that it could literally take days to get your data back. Even though it seems like the internet's fast when we're doing things like streaming movies and downloading files and things like that, when you're downloading databases and files that can be in the gigabyte or even terabyte range, the internet is extremely slow. So you may have to find an alternate method of recovery. For example, having the backup provider, if they'll do this, put your data on a drive, copy it off to a drive, and ship you the drive. It's faster to have them do that, even if it takes a day for them to back it up and then another day for you to get it through the delivery service, than having to just tell it to download the files and hope that your internet connection stays up and that you get everything. And part of the problem is you don't even know, based on the traffic of a local internet connection, which are often compromised during disasters. When the Red Cross and FEMA show up, all of a sudden the local internet system is pretty stressed. But your bottom line problem is a slow recovery. That's why you want to look at disk to disk or disk to BDR. Lost files. Again, we talked about this when it came to the concept of archiving. But when I say lost files, these are files or things like emails that are deleted and they have not been archived. So when people are asking, can you recover the email from this employee that left a year ago and is now suing us or something like that, or we need it for business purposes, it's just not going to be there because that information needs to be archived. Corrupted backups. The problem with backups is the backups rely ultimately on hard drives. And over time, hard drives can become corrupted. And it's just the nature of the technology that sectors on a hard drive can have a problem, and some of the backups will use a system where you back up, you do a complete backup, and that's your base backup image, and then you only back up things that have changed since that base image. So essentially the backups are all dependent on the base image and then on the last backup. So if you backed up a base image on a Monday and then you had this type of system, on Tuesday you'd only back up the things that changed since Monday, and then on Wednesday you would back up the things that changed since Tuesday and so forth. Let's say you had a server fail on Friday, and you would go back to recover. If the main backup or even Monday's backup had a problem, you aren't going to recover. So there are different types of systems, there are different software applications that run these, but there are different strategies you can take. Sometimes, in some cases, you may want to do an original backup every day. So on Monday, it backs up everything. On Tuesday, it backs up everything. On Wednesday, it backs up everything, and so forth. Or you might set it where you do your initial backup on Monday, and then on Tuesday, it backs up the differences from Monday, but then on Wednesday, it also backs up all the differences from Monday. That's what we call a differential backup. And what that does is allow you to only have to recover 2 files, the original and then today's. And then over time, one of the things you can do is to say we're going to use either incremental or differential backups, but we'll create new images every month or every 6 months or whatever. The problem with this is that you never know what's happening. So the message is that when it comes to recovery failures, the best way to prevent them is to be doing test restores. So you don't wait for a disaster to find out if your backups are working. You can do a drill and test your backup. And at the beginning, when you're first starting it out, maybe you want to do them more often. Maybe a few days after you start your backup process, you want to do a recovery test. Over time, you may push it out to once a month or once every 3 months. But one of the big things that we had to deal with was that people would tell us their backups weren't recoverable, and we never would know why. One of the other reasons for recovery failures is what we call system dependencies. System dependencies mean that in order to run your electronic health record system, you need a server that runs the EHR software, but that might also connect to a SQL server that houses the database. So one of the reasons for recovery failures that we dealt with was that people were not backing up everything that they needed to. They thought they only had to back up, for example, the SQL server because that's where the data was, and we didn't have the EHR server that connected to it. So this was another process that we would go through, is to make sure that we knew what the dependencies were, and there again, that's why testing is so important. 2 other risks that are associated with online backup are, one is non-compliance. HIPAA says you have to do it. If you aren't doing it, you're not compliant. And the last one is that if you don't choose the right vendors, and I'm talking about a cloud vendor that complies with HIPAA, then you're going to be committing a data breach by storing data with them. Simply transferring a file out to a company that does not comply with HIPAA is essentially a data breach, because they're an unauthorized organization. They're not authorized to store the data, and you've just copied it out there into their system. So that's essentially the same thing as someone taking a laptop that has patient data on it and walking out your door and being in possession of it. It's a different kind of data breach, but it is a data breach.
Yeah, and that's a big one. We've certainly seen lots of kind of nonsensical claims by backup services that say, oh, well, we don't have to comply with HIPAA. But of course they do. It's really not up to them whether they have to comply with HIPAA. If they've got PHI, they have to comply.
You're right, Brian. And there's some that don't get it, and there's some that think that it's just a legal exercise, and there's some that have done just the bare minimum, essentially, to look compliant. But it is something that we have to deal with.
So we sort of have touched on this a little bit, but let's. It's good to see the code here. Is online backup required by HIPAA?
The simple answer, and this is a quick slide, is yes. HIPAA, so when you see that 164.308 number, that's actually where this is in the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 164.308, and it says establish and implement procedures to create and maintain retrievable exact copies of electronic protected health information, and this is required, not addressable. So it's pretty obvious And then where it says backup plan, HIPAA actually requires that you document your plan to do this. So you have to be able to show people. Now, when we talk about documenting a backup plan, it doesn't have to be a 50-page written document. It could be that you document what your strategy is. For example, we're going to use a disk-to-disk or a disk-to-BDR strategy for backup, and then we're going to back up our data at the following intervals, and depending on how big your organization is and how many servers you have, that would determine kind of the size of the backup plan and the extent that you have to go through to document everything. But it's really not a complicated document, but when we go into organizations and say we'd like to see your backup plan, almost none of them have it. And as you said earlier, they're very surprised to find out they were supposed to do it.
Yeah, I really wonder if we were to sort of have some, ability to look at all the policies and procedures out there that providers have, and for that matter, business associates too, how many of them have a backup plan? And my guess is that it's not, even if they have a plan, it's probably not documented properly in many, many cases. So,
well, and Brian, one of the things that we found, sorry to interrupt you, but
no, please go ahead.
We were looking at a backup plan for a company, and I said, are you really still using an IBM System 36? They said, oh, no, we haven't used that for years. Why are you asking? I said, because it says you're backing it up every night. When people hand us a backup plan, it has to be current. Think of an audit, that if you were being audited or if there was a data breach and you were being investigated, and you gave someone a backup plan that had servers on it that you haven't used in 5 or even 10 years, that's going to make them wonder about your compliance, and it also may make them look a little bit harder at you, and it could possibly be the tipping point between a penalty or just a corrective action plan. I don't know that that's ever happened, but what I'm really saying, it's pretty easy to have a backup plan and to keep it current compared to a lot of the other documentation and things that you have to do in HIPAA.
So how can providers go about securing the backup data?
Well, some of it really isn't your choice if you're the customer. You have to find out what the process is that your vendor's going to use. And this is one of the things that you want to consider when you're choosing a vendor. So HIPAA says that data has to be encrypted during transport. And transport in this case is if you're connecting to the internet. Again, the topic here is online backup. So encryption during transport is important. So you need to find out if the communications method that is between you and your vendor is encrypted, or if the data is encrypted before it goes and then it's sent as an encrypted file. You want to look at encryption at rest. At rest is the term for stored data. So when you create a file and save it onto a hard drive, that file is now at rest. When we're looking at how the backups are handled, if they're stored on a device, even if you're going to carry a hard drive home, you want that data to be encrypted, because encryption allows you to not have to report the loss of the device. So if you lost a hard drive that was encrypted or had encrypted data on it, you don't have to report that as a data breach. When you're dealing with online backup providers and you're sending the data to them, you want to know that the data in their system, once it's stored on the hard drive, is encrypted, so that if there's something that happens at their end, that they're able to, that they don't have to report your data as being breached. The way that the backups work with many of the companies is that because it takes so long to upload data. Now, I mentioned before, the internet seems fast when you're, say, trying to stream a movie or download a file. If you looked at what you're paying for from an internet service provider, you're probably getting a lot more speed down than up. So some of the providers will have a service that says, for example, it's 5 megs down and 1 meg up, or it's 10 megs down and 2 megs up. Think about that speed going up, because if you have to move gigabytes of data up through a slow internet connection, then it's going to take a long time to get to the provider. It's going to get to be a long time before your initial backup finishes. So what some of the providers do is that they allow you to install software locally, create a backup, put it on a hard drive, and ship it to them. They then load it into their system, so that eliminates that initial backup going across the internet. Then you connect to their system through the internet, and it now just backs up the difference between what you sent them on the hard drive and what's changed since then. So the encryption of the data on the hard drive is important, because if you ship the hard drive to the vendor and it got lost, you just created a data breach. And the state of Alaska paid $1.7 million because one of the techs in the Alaska State Health Department lost a backup drive. So this is a very serious thing. You want to make sure that if you do have to ship the data out, that it's encrypted before it goes. The other area that we have identified the risks with is that if you have to recover into the cloud, so the higher level backup providers or solution providers will have a service where if your building burns down, you can back up into their cloud. So what you're doing is now you're going to take that data that may be encrypted in its backup form, and you're going to recover it into their cloud and essentially create a virtual server that you're going to connect to. Well, once you've got the virtual server running, that data is no longer encrypted. It's no longer in its sealed package. You've kind of opened it up the same way you would if you had to recover locally into a server in your office. So now you have some of the same challenges that you would have managing users in your network. So if you recover into the cloud, you have to maintain the same level of security and give only the right people the right access as if you would if they were working in your office. And then the last area of concern is that if you decide you're not going to use that vendor anymore, so you want to quit and use someone else or change to a different type of system, or if you have recovered in the cloud and now you've set up servers locally and these servers are ready to go, what do you do with the data that's sitting out at that vendor? So you have to know that the vendor is going to properly destroy the data. And keep in mind what I said earlier, that when I worked for one of the online backup companies, our data center was backed up to another one. So there's kind of a ripple effect here, that when you are storing data with a vendor and then you choose to no longer work with that vendor, you need to know that your data has been removed from that, from their systems and from all of their backups. So again, just to review, we have to secure data during transport electronically while it's stored on systems, during shipping if we have to send a hard drive out to the vendor to do the initial backup. If we've recovered into the cloud, we have to maintain security on the data because now our users are going to be accessing that from a remote location. And then if we decide we're not going to do business with the company, or if we have recovered into the cloud, now we no longer need to use that cloud server, how is that data being destroyed so it doesn't become a data breach?
So here's a great question. Do people need to have business associate agreements with whoever's doing their online backup?
And the answer is yes. And we've heard from companies that say, well, the data is encrypted and so forth. We don't have to sign business associate agreements. That's not true. That all changed last year with the HIPAA Omnibus final rule. So who do you sign the agreement with? If you're a medical provider, if you're a covered entity, which would be either a doctor's office, for example, a hospital, or even a health plan, if you're one of the covered entities and you're using online backup, you have to kind of follow the money trail to determine who you're going to be paying. So if you're going direct to a vendor, you would pay that vendor. You would have a business associate agreement with the vendor directly. If you're buying a service through a solution provider, so you don't get a bill from a vendor, you get for example, a managed services bill for IT services that includes online backup from your solution provider, then you just have your business associate agreement with the solution provider. And then we have to talk about subcontractors. difference, because when you're dealing with online backup, in almost every situation I've ever dealt with, there have been subcontractors. The online backup companies do not own their own data centers. They rent space in large data centers, and the reason they do this is that the data centers are secure and they have literally tons of air conditioning and multiple power sources and multiple internet connections. They're very resilient, and it's a higher level of security and resilience than most people can afford to put in their offices. So the data center that works with your vendor is also a business associate because they house your data, but they sign a business associate agreement with your vendor, with your solution provider or your vendor. So let's say you're using ABC Company as your solution provider and he includes backup as part of his monthly service. You sign the business associate agreement with ABC Company. ABC Company signs what we call a subcontractor business associate with a vendor. For example, they may be reselling someone else's software or backup service. They also sign it with the data centers where the data is stored. And then it goes down the line. So if you're a covered entity, you don't have to have many business associate agreements. You don't have to have one with the data center. You don't have to have one with the software company that supplies software to your online backup vendor. You just have to have the agreement with your vendor, and then they have the agreements with their vendors or their subcontractors. It kind of gets confusing, but the reason this becomes important is these are some areas where we've seen online backup companies run out of answers. When we'll ask, will you sign a business associate agreement? They all say yes, or many of them say yes. And then when we say, okay, can you show us that you have a business associate agreement with your data center or with the vendor of the software that you use, that's where the answers kind of dry up. And we're going to talk about how to choose a vendor and some of the questions you can ask.
Do folks need more than a business associate agreement?
Yes, and here's why. A lot of the vendors will say, we'll sign a business associate agreement. You can go up to their websites and they say, click here or call this number if you want us to sign a business associate agreement. That means that they've handled the legal requirement for compliance. It doesn't mean that they as an organization are really compliant beyond that agreement. And in some cases, and I talk to these companies all the time, in some cases they'll tell us, well, our attorney said all we need to do is sign business associate agreements. Well, attorneys sometimes look at things, just from the legal aspect and not necessarily the operational aspect of HIPAA. And they'll tell them, you need to sign agreements. They'll work hard to come up with an agreement that meets everybody's needs, which is great. But that's where an attorney's services typically end, and the organization itself still has a lot of work to do. If they read the agreement that they're signing, it says they're going to comply with HIPAA. So some of the assurances of vendor compliance include that the vendors, the people that you're dealing with, and every one of their subcontractors has to have HIPAA-specific policies and procedures. They have to have a HIPAA risk assessment. They have to train their workforce in HIPAA. They want to have evidence that they're actually complying with HIPAA and that the services that they're performing are properly documented. And the reason this becomes so important, and this is for everyone on the call that has to comply with HIPAA, just doing things is not compliance with HIPAA. What could happen is that 6 months from now or a year from now, and HIPAA requires you to keep documentation for 6 years. So up to 6 years from now, someone can say, it's been alleged, for example, that you sent a hard drive out or that you disposed of a hard drive that contained patient information a year ago, and we need to see your records of how that hard drive was properly was disposed of a year later. And this is the type of thing that you need to consider when you're dealing in a regulated environment. It's not just, well, we do the right thing, or I can remember how that was handled 6 months or a year ago. A year later, the person that actually was involved in that may no longer be working for you. They may not remember that hard drive. You may not have specific, even if you did a hard drive yesterday and handled it properly, How do you have evidence that you did that 6 months or a year ago? So these are things that you want to talk to the vendors about. And a big one is the subcontractor compliance. A lot of the vendors have done what they need to, and even if they have put in HIPAA policies and procedures and done a risk assessment, when it moves further, and again, in online backup, it's very common to have a software vendor involved that wrote the software that your online backup provider is using. Multiple data centers can be in play, and also when we talk about things like BDRs, even the companies that repair the BDRs, they end up with devices that have data on them. So subcontractor compliance is huge. And one of the things that we've heard many times from companies that are in this business and also from the data centers where the information is stored, well, we're compliant with SOC 2 or SSAE 16, and we've been audited for PCI compliance, which is for credit cards, or we've been audited because we store banking information. And that's all good information, and the organization may pass all of those tests, but it's not HIPAA. And if you're audited or investigated for HIPAA compliance, you need to show that you've done things that are specific to HIPAA. And while many of the things overlap, you can think about the Olympic symbols where you have these circles that overlap. There's some things that are outside of the circle for every one of these compliance requirements, and then there's some overlap. So when you think about it that way, you'll realize that there's going to be something in HIPAA that's different. Just because you comply with PCI or some other standard does not mean that you're HIPAA compliant.
So what type of backup solution is best then?
Well, we spend a lot of time talking about the different kinds. So data sent to the cloud, just to the cloud, is low cost, but you have to keep in mind now you're going to have a slow recovery. Data copied to a disk and then sent to the cloud is going to be a higher cost because you're going to have the local disk. Now you've got fast local data recovery, but you're still going to have slow recovery from the cloud. And then if you use a BDR solution, and then let's say that that provider also has the ability to recover into the cloud, that's your highest cost backup and recovery solution, but it provides the most. It provides fast local data recovery, fast local server recovery, and fast server recovery from the cloud or into the cloud.
So it sounds like it kind of depends on your situation and what your parameters are.
And what you want to spend and how fast you want to recover.
Yeah. So then, bearing that in mind, how can people choose the right vendor?
Well, the first thing you have to do is kind of have a plan, and the image here of a checklist is good, where if you put down a list of questions or a list of features and benefits, that you'll be able to use a systematic way of choosing the vendor. First thing, you have to define your strategy. So if you go back to that last slide, you have to decide, do I want to do just local backup? Do I want to do backup into the cloud and not have any local recovery capability and so forth? Remember that the mission of backup isn't backup. It's recovery. So when you think about this, think about how long you can be down before you're recovered and how old the data can be. So if you can miss a day's worth of data, a full day's worth of data, and you can be down for a week, then that's your tolerance for risk, and you understand what the effect would be on your business and any associated costs or customer service issues. If you can be down for a day only, and you can have, and your data has to be less than 4 hours old, for example, or 6 hours or something like that, now you're going to have to pay more for backup. When you're doing vendor evaluation, you want to look at the business associate agreements, make sure that they'll sign one, number one, and also that it's acceptable to you, and also the compliance assurance to make sure that they're actually doing the things that the business associate agreement says they have to do to protect the data. You want to verify your vendors are not just talking about HIPAA and business associate agreements and really not complying themselves. And then my suggestion, based on years of experience, not just in healthcare, but all across the business world, is that it really takes a professional to properly configure the backups, monitor them, and test them to make sure that everything's recoverable. In today's world, it's not a simple thing to recover, for example, an electronic health record system or an exchange server or anything that may be absolutely critical to your business. So this is one where if you don't have a professional doing it, you may not be able to recover. One of the things that we've done is created some checklists and some surveys that our clients can use to send out to vendors, and these are very generic, doesn't have our name, it's not advertising, it's basically asking questions. Will you sign a business associate agreement? What else have you done to comply with HIPAA? Will your subcontractors comply? I've put my email address at the bottom of this slide, mike@semelconsulting.com, MIKE@SEMEL consulting.com. And if you send me an email, I will send you a copy of our checklist and vendor survey, and it's up to you to determine. One of the issues that we may run into with people from this webinar is this company compliant? Should I do business with this company? I'm doing business with this company. Should I stick with them? We can't answer those questions. Only those companies can answer the right questions, and then you have to decide. We're careful for a couple of reasons. One is that we don't want to get in legal trouble saying someone's compliant or non-compliant. We can't make that decision, partly because compliance can change on a daily basis. So you need to be comfortable that you've selected the right vendor, and then that your backups are going to work so that you can recover.
Well, we're nearly out of time, and we did get a couple of questions, but I think we'll hold those for the written responses. We'll send those on to our expert, Mike Semel, and he'll be happy to follow up with you directly. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in, or you can write Mike directly. You can see his email address there. It is mike@semelconsulting.com. You can also learn more about Mike Semel and his professional services at www.semelconsulting.com. So I want to thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Great information in this session.
Thanks, Brian.
I'd also like to thank all of our attendees. We had a couple of folks ask about getting the slides. Remember that you'll receive those slides and a video version of this session and the follow-up email for today's event. So watch your email inbox for that follow-up. I should mention that Format Approved also offers HIPAA training if you're looking to meet those training requirements, and that training was authored by our very own Mike Semel here in today's session. So if you do need training, visit www.formedtraining.com to learn more about the training options that are available. Visit formatapproved.com to learn more about our upcoming Learning Lunches. The Learning Lunch button will take you to the registration page for our upcoming webinars. Our next Learning Lunch will air on April 15th and has the title EHR Ease of Use, Enabling Better Data Input and Output. Keep an eye on your email box and our homepage for other upcoming topics, and thank you again for joining us today.